Well, thank you all for coming to this lecture. I would like to thank my colleagues at CNS, especially Asli Bali, who I mentioned sort of single-handedly almost created these centers and raised the funds for it to have these series for several years. So I'm extremely grateful to you, Asli. Susan Slimovic and Omar Boom, who also contributed to organize this year's lecture series. I also wish to give a shout out to our program manager and our other staff, Joanna Romero, for their logistical support. For those of you who are not familiar with the center, I think most of you are, but CNES is really a research hub where over 100 faculty from humanities, social sciences, arts, and the law school collaborate in a variety of research and pedagogical projects. It was founded in 1957 and is one of the oldest and most distinguished UC centers for interdisciplinary research on the Middle East. We provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and the dissemination of information within and beyond campus. And I hope that those of you who are interested in our program check out our website. Some of these lectures are actually sort of available on our website. And we have many other events. And we have a third Averroës lecture coming up as well in May. So please check our website. We also are proud of the fact that our public programs attract people of MENA heritage living in Los Angeles area and broader audiences with an interest in the Middle Eastern culture. Today's talk, as I mentioned, is part of our Averroës lecture series that has been underwritten by a very generous anonymous donor and which focuses on Jewish communities in Muslim land prior to the 20th century. We have named the series, at least the way Asli envisioned it, we have named the series Averroës, the Latin name for Ibn Rushd, the 12th century Andalusian polymath, whose philosophical work integrated Islamic traditions and ancient Greek thoughts to point to the rich history of Andalusia and specifically Cordoba's Jewish-Muslim relation as really a model of coexistence, as well to the connections between Averroës and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, both of whom were committed to intellectual exchange and communal life across religious boundaries. I think this is particularly timely now. It is my great pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Professor Michel Campos, who is an associate professor of modern Middle Eastern history at the University of Florida and a former Fulbright scholar. Professor Campos' scholarship and teaching focuses on the late Ottoman Empire and its political culture, the social history of Palestine, and Muslim and non-Muslim relations. She is the author of Ottoman Brothers, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in early 20th century Palestine, which won the 2011 Yonatan Shapiro Book Prize of the Association of Israel Studies. In it, Professor Campos explores the development of Ottoman collective identity in the aftermath of the July 908 Ottoman Revolution by tracing the complex ways in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews defined, practiced, and contested the contours of imperial citizenship and cultural belonging. For these communities, a wide range of questions about their identities arose, such as what did it mean to be Ottoman in the first place, what role did religion and ethnicity play in politics, and what did liberty, reform, and enfranchisement look like for these communities. Professor Campos' talk today is entitled Unmixing the Holy City, Urban Coexistence and Segregation in the Early 20th Century Jerusalem. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you. I want to thank Ali and Asla and Omar and everyone at the center for making this visit possible, and Johanna, of course, for making it so painless, I should say. And thank you all for coming. I assume that you all finished your taxes early and you're able to be here, but in case not, I will stick to the timeline that was proposed so you can go and file before the evening is over. Hearing the description of the lecture series, I just want to point out that I'm going to be skirting a little bit or pushing the generosity of the intention of the series because I will be leaving the late 19th century and going up into the first decades of the 20th century as well, beginning with a few reflections and ending with a few reflections on the modern period. Last summer, an altercation took place between a Jerusalem city councilman, Aryeh King, this is from his Facebook page, and a Palestinian sesame bagel seller. According to the post King wrote on his Facebook wall, the unlicensed peddler was selling his wares on the Jewish fast day of Tisha B'Av, a visible affront to the Jewish character and Jewish feeling of the city. The answer of the municipal inspectors and King, who rushed to the scene, was to personally enact, as he called, the Judaization of the city, triumphantly represented here by the photo of the peddler's overturned cart with all of his bagels on the ground. Now, despite the public outcry in the aftermath of this post, few would dispute the underlying premise that Jerusalem is a conflict city par excellence, a highly sectarianized and nationalized space where everyday conflicts take on national importance. Physically divided in the aftermath of the 1948 war, but only symbolically reunified in 1967, Jerusalem continues to consist of distinct and separate Jewish and Arab spaces. Transgressions of this division are highly charged and deeply politicized. The sectarian division of the city is continually reinforced and institutionalized in mundane ways by disparities in municipal funding and infrastructure, as well as sectarian policies in governance and urban planning. This incident, however, was much more than just a story of a city councilman flexing his muscles. Before he was elected to municipal office in 2013, King had served as the founder and director of the Israel Lands Fund, which redeems land in East Jerusalem and elsewhere throughout Greater Israel. King, the ILL, and its Israeli allies and international donors see the democratic Israel that allows, as they put it, any Arab or other non-Jew to purchase land and settle anywhere as a danger to the future of the country. As some of you are no doubt aware, this territorial and monopolistic view of the settlers' movement made it into the nation-state law passed by the Knesset last summer. Although the penultimate draft promoted the legalization of segregation between Jews and Arabs, the final version instead called for Jewish settlement, or Hityashvut Yehudit, to be recognized as a national value. This was the result of a decade-long assault against Jewish-Arab urban integration in Israel that has been carried out not only in the parliament, but also in the judiciary, rabbinical rulings, the press, and popular culture. And I'll just refer here to the letter that got the most traction in 2010. There were several letters throughout 2008 and 2010 signed by rabbis speaking to this question of the permissibility or desirability of Jewish Arab or Jewish non-Jewish integration in Israel. By the end of 2010, between 5 and 6 dozen rabbis had signed on to this, and there was a great deal of public support that saw non-Jews living next to, in the same community as Jews, as a danger to the Jewish value of the state of Israel, as well as a danger to a whole slew of other things, economic danger, a moral danger, and other things. At this moment in the early 21st century, this division of urban space into distinct and separate Jewish and Arab zones, buttressed by political institutions, religious law, and social norms, seems normalized in the collective consciousness of both sides. However, it bears remembering that this is a relatively recent development and one that requires constant vigilance. My talk today draws on my ongoing book project, Unmixing the Holy City, which asks questions about how late Ottoman Jerusalem's urban space was shared, marked off, protected, and contested, both on the level of ideas about ethnic, religious, civic, and later national communities, as well as in daily practice, due to economic, legal, religious, and political exigencies. I examine the transformation of Jerusalem from an imperial city to a national city, a process that took place over decades and was due to numerous factors, as we'll see. In imperial Jerusalem, different religious, ethnic, and social groups often lived in the same neighborhoods, and even at some times in the same building or courtyard. They belonged to the same craft guilds and Masonic lodges, worked and shopped in the same markets, went into business together, and sat on the same governmental and civil councils. To be sure, they also haggled over real estate, competed economically, argued publicly, and occasionally clashed physically. I wrote about some of these aspects in my earlier work, but this project really emerged in the gaps that book left behind. Specifically, in the aftermath of the First World War, Jerusalem underwent a protracted process of urban sectarianization in matters of both public and private space. By the 1930s, Jerusalem's once shared spaces, public spaces, transportation lines, even public institutions, had become largely separated. How did this happen and why? So what I'd like to do tonight is to provide some brief sketches of this process of imperial mixing and colonial or national unmixing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing primarily on residential patterns, but also hinting at two additional important factors, the role of public spaces and municipal governance. As we shall see, these patterns and processes were never neat and unidirectional, but taken together, they succeeded in a wide-scale urban polarization in Jerusalem by the late 1920s. Now, in doing so, I'm trying to connect a few missing dots in the field of Middle Eastern and urban studies. And without going to an extensive literature review, I'll just mention three gaps that I'm primarily trying to speak to. First, despite being the most studied city in the Middle East, the literature on Jerusalem has significant absences, most notably the relative absence of Jerusalemites, so social history has been subservient to political, diplomatic, and religious histories, and there's also a temporal gap, although there are very good works that examine the post-48 divided city and post-67 united city. The pre-48 dynamics have been largely ignored, or there are a few important recent works that have filled this gap to a certain extent. The second gap that I'm really trying to get at here is, although heterogeneous cities were not at all uncommon among Ottoman cities, and despite this wonderful and really largely widely developed tradition in architectural history and Ottoman urban history, there's still many unanswered questions about the contours of religious and ethnic diversity in the late Ottoman period, particularly as it relates to demography and space. Third, I'm trying to engage with a revisionist social science literature on urban segregation, in which scholars are rethinking questions of scale, adopting more caution with regards to aggregating differences and assigning causality, and displaying sensitivity to the meaning and value of segregation or integration for various social groups, as well as expanding their focus beyond residential segregation to other urban contact zones and measures. So those are the three main areas in which I see this project really trying to speak to, and we'll see how successfully I'm able to do that. But first, I want to give a snapshot of the Ottoman courtyard. Jerusalem in the late 19th century was a city undergoing wide-ranging transformation. Within a few decades, it attained independent administrative status, was connected via rail to a major imperial port city, Jaffa. We see here the rail line on the right. And was run by an active city council and court that carried out imperial and urban reforms. And we see here a picture on the left from one of these many imperial celebrations that speak to the embeddedness of Jerusalem within an Ottoman imperial landscape. According to official Ottoman census records, the nüfus, in the early 1880s, Jerusalem was home to at least 4,000 households totaling over 17,000 people. At that point, Muslims constituted the plurality at 38% of the city, Jews comprised 35%, and Christians 27%. All of them resided within the city's 16th century walls, as only a handful of extramuros compounds and neighborhoods, or almost all of them, because only a handful of extramuros neighborhoods had been established at that point. Now, around this time as well, in the 1880s, the city became a magnet for migration from neighboring villages and provinces, as well as increasingly from Africa, Asia, and Europe. This migration had begun modestly in the 1870s, picked up steam in the 1880s, and skyrocketed in the 1890s. So much so that by the second Ottoman census in 1905, the city's population had doubled to more than 33,000 Ottoman citizens. By this point, the census records tell us the city was about half 50% Jewish, 30% Muslim, and 20% Christian. Now, I'll just insert a verbal footnote here that I don't put a tremendous amount of stock in these numbers for their scientific precision. There are important qualifications to both the methodology of the census as well as the political relevance of demography and counting who was there and who was there when. But I think it's just there in terms of providing us some sense of the scale of change and the relative size of different communities. Also important to note is that in the intervening 25 years between that first and second Ottoman census, the city had expanded outside of the walls at a rapid pace, so that just under half of the city's population was living outside of the walls, or extramuros. The census records give us an extraordinary and unprecedented opportunity to actually map where these people were living in the city, and to explore what residential patterns might tell us about intercommunal relations. By and large, throughout the empire, there were few legal constraints to where religious and ethnic groups could live, in contrast to Europe or even perhaps in Morocco, although recent work has showed us that itself was more complicated than previously thought. Over the centuries, a variety of patterns emerged in the Ottoman Empire, where you have, in some places, ethno-religious clustering, in other places, patterns of very heterogeneous neighborhoods. Those of you who have been to Jerusalem, and I assume at least some of you have, of course know the famous four quarters of the Old City, or the Intramural City, which is a cognitive mapping of the city that was introduced by the Palestine Exploration Fund, the British-sponsored imperial and sort of biblical surveying group in the 1860s, and was adopted by almost all Western maps since then. And this cognitive mapping of the PDF places Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Armenians into their so-called proper place in the city's landscape. However, with access to a greater variety of primary sources, like the Ottoman census, as well as the publications of memoirs and other revisionist scholarly studies in this last generation, we now know that these boundaries were far blurrier and more porous than previously understood. For example, we see that of the 7 intramuros neighborhoods, which I've mapped out here, only 3 of them are what we could call religiously homogeneous. And I'm referring to neighborhoods that have more than 80% of the neighborhood consisting of one religious group. The remaining 4 had substantial mixing, between 20 to 45% of members from 2 or all 3 major religious groups. Now, this picture becomes even blurrier or fuzzier when we disaggregate religious groups into the various millets, or ethnic groups, which is actually what the Ottoman census officials cared about and how they counted them anyway. And so we see here, it's a much more pluralistic and heterogeneous city if we're looking at the distinctions between Christians, whether it be Greek Orthodox or Latin or Armenian Christians, or between Jews who are divided between Sephardi, Maghrebi, and Ashkenazi communities. If we play with scale a little bit more, or take a closer look at one neighborhood, Al-Wad, in 1905, this was the most heterogeneous, or the most mixed neighborhood, and the second most populous quarter in that census. Al-Wad, which we see here, was the home to over 3,500 inhabitants, or approximately 10% of the city's Ottoman population, living in 760 households. These households were headed by men in government service, religious officials. There were merchants, craftsmen, and even ordinary day laborers and builders. Half of all of Al-Wad's households were headed by native Jerusalemites. And for them, Al-Wad was a tightly knit neighborhood of dense networks of families who resided there for generations, with close ties of marriage and kinship within the neighborhood as well as to adjacent neighborhoods. We'll see here as well that it was also the site of a number of important religious, political, economic, and cultural institutions. It was a location of the government house, or the sarai, as well as the Mahkama Sharia, the Islamic court. It adjoined the holiest sites for the 3 religions, as well as housing other smaller religious sites, smaller mosques and yeshivot and other religious sites. Featured major markets and bathhouses, as well as the newly opened Khalidiyya Library, which is an important cultural site at the turn of the century. As such, it's important to note that residents had access to most of the resources they could need within or very near to the neighborhood, and most of the wage earners likely worked in or adjacent to the neighborhood. In addition, the numerous state, religious, and economic institutions in the neighborhood meant that Jerusalemites often came from other parts of the city to Al-Wad to take care of their administrative, legal, shopping, or other needs, making Al-Wad a crossroads for Jerusalemites from all backgrounds. On the surface then, Al-Wad here seems to fit the picture of Ottoman urban heterogeneity, or it's oftentimes referred to in shorthand as sort of an Ottoman cosmopolitanism that several scholars have criticized as being overly nostalgic. However, if we change the scale of our inquiry once again and map these households through GIS, what is revealed is that this most mixed neighborhood, or neighborhood that seems to be the most integrated, in fact was very unevenly mixed, with areas of extreme segregation as well as some areas of integration, underscoring the fact that scale matters. So one of the things that we see is that this quadrant right here, the northwestern quadrant of Al-Wad, is where we have a significant concentration and clustering. Most of the Christian households resided in this corner here. But I should also point out that they were not isolated. These were very mixed streets. But we do still see the significant concentration of Christians in that corner. We also see significant concentration of Muslim households where you do have isolation. So more than 90% of the households on the eastern edge of the neighborhood were occupied by Muslims. And this makes sense if we see that, of course, we have gates joining to the Dome of the Rock, or the Haram al-Sharif complex there. One of the other things that we see is that the streets that become most mixed are concentrated here, and there are a few really interesting demographic characteristics for these most mixed streets that really call into question what mixing might have actually meant in the Ottoman period. For one, there were a higher concentration of newcomers to the city. Another thing is that many of them tended to be holders of lower occupations or lower prestige professions or occupations, a higher representation of day laborers living in the mixed streets, for example. And it also had the lowest representation of elite households, marked by these honorifics of Effendi, Bey, or Khawaja. So it seems that there is, very clearly an economic correlation to living on a mixed street, as well as perhaps a cultural correlation, or a sense of culture. In other words, whereas the neighborhood aggregate for Al-Wad suggests that religion is unimportant, millet actually does turn out to be a significant variable in segregation on the scale of building and of street. So I'll note here that in terms of the buildings, there were very few mixed buildings, or buildings that were occupied by residents of different, not only religious groups, but even different millets. So there was not a single building that had joint Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic residents. They were all either entirely Greek Orthodox or entirely Roman Catholic. There were very few mixed buildings that had Jewish Muslim households, and none which had Christian Muslim or Christian Jewish residents. So we also see that there was very little mixed inter-Jewish housing. So that we had very few buildings in which you had Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, and Maghrebim living together in the same building, or some constellation of two of those. So the question emerges, why do we see this pattern? And what impact might this have on our understanding of this idea of Ottoman urban mixing, or of urban heterogeneity? I'll briefly outline three major reasons. First is the obvious legal question. Outright ownership of private property in Jerusalem was relatively rare. Instead, much of the land had the legal status of waqf, or religious endowment. Many of the Muslim awqaf khairiyya, or religious endowments, date back to Ayyubid and Mamluk times, where there was a very particular project of Islamizing the space of the city after the end of the Crusades. In Al-Wad, we know that a large percentage of the houses and stores in a number of important sectors of the neighborhood were waqf properties. Now, awqaf are rented across religious lines, so just because it is a property that belongs to a Muslim religious endowment does not mean that only Muslims could rent it. In fact, we have many examples of Muslim religious endowments that were rented by Christians or Jews for long terms, but we certainly know that the legal prescriptions were a little bit stricter in those cases. We also know that there were some legal prescriptions as well as social prescriptions against non-Muslims living near mosques. And that certainly can account for the very low representation or very low presence of non-Muslims near the Haram al-Sharif, although we do have another mosque in the neighborhood right around here, the Al-Karami Mosque, which was actually a very mixed street. So this prescription against non-Muslims living near a mosque was not universally applied by any means. Another factor that we have is that religious institutions played an important role in marking and policing communal boundaries. For Christians, this is key to explaining their clustering and concentration in this northwestern quadrant of the neighborhood, as well as the building level segregation, or the fact that there was no mixing of Greek Orthodox and Latin Christians and the level of buildings. The patriarchates owned properties and leased them out to their co-religionists as a way of disciplining and rewarding and the community, as well as reinforcing communal boundaries. This role of disciplining, we know that the Greek patriarch used in the aftermath of the 1908 Greek rebellion, or Arab rebellion against the Greek patriarchate, in which he evicted Greek families who were supporting the Greek Orthodox families who were supporting the call for reform within the Orthodox community from their housing. We also know, of course, that Christians used this demand for housing, or this threat of converting if they weren't given housing, for themselves. So housing becomes an important tool both for the church officials as well as church believers. And here are just a couple of petitions in which we have the requests and then later the threat by various Christians to church officials if they're not given housing, what might happen to them. For Jews, there developed since the 16th century at least, that's the earliest literature that I found, the institution of the property use leaseholder, or the chazakah, for the rabbinical leadership, which standardized and attempted to control this practice. It had broader community-wide and city-wide implications. And this practice was seen in Salonika, in Istanbul, I think also even in North Africa, as well as in Jerusalem. And the literature that I've seen, some of the rabbinical texts that respond to this, argue that they're trying to control prices, particularly in periods where you have increasing Jewish immigration, so housing prices go up, so they want to control that, as well as to limit the interaction with and financial exchange between Jews and non-Jews, and finally to give Jews a say over potential renters or neighbors, which could also have the effect of preserving Jewish residential enclaves. We have here on the left a rabbinical proclamation from 1859 in which the rabbis were complaining about these rising rents and the eviction of renters who couldn't afford this new cost increase. They also were trying to bring the Jewish machzikim, or the leaseholders, back into the fold of the community to remind them of their obligations to the community and to warn them against transgressing the boundaries, that they are moving closer to the non-Jews by their practices. And they also, the rabbis, and this was a joint proclamation by the Sephardi and Ashkenazi rabbis, that they required all Jews in Jerusalem, the machzikim, or those who hold this lease by the Muslim waqf or property owner, that they should register in the rabbinical courts and bring their contracts with their non-Jewish landowner for the court's review. And they forbade individual Jews from going to non-Muslim or non-Jewish landlords on their own when there was a Jewish leaseholder in a neighboring courtyard. But of course, we know that despite this prohibition, we know that Jews, of course, did rent directly from non-Jewish landlords, whether it was private property or waqf property. Disputes between tenants or contracts between tenants and their non-Jewish landlords were adjudicated regularly in the Islamic courts. So the rabbis' repeated attempts to enforce communal regulations on housing revealed their very loss of control over those communal boundaries, and their repeated attempts to reinforce those communal boundaries. Now, given the close quarters, the shared spaces, such as restrooms, kitchens, the courtyard, as well as religious, dietary, and other laws that regulated home and daily life, it is perhaps not unusual that interreligious mixing was rare at the building level. What is somewhat more surprising is that the Chazakah institution appeared to preserve ethnic lines within the Jewish community as much as religious lines between the Jewish community and other communities. As I mentioned earlier, only 7 buildings with 16 households were ethnically mixed amongst Maghrebi, Sephardi, and Ashkenazi Jews, which would also suggest that social networks, cultural preferences would have a large role to play in residential patterns beyond the legal, economic, and religious factors that we've raised already. Perhaps, and this comes from some of the geographic literature on syntax, spatial syntax, which would be to suggest that this correlation of sort of lower prestige, new immigrants, sort of more common laborers in these mixed streets could represent some kind of a cultural sentiment towards these streets. We know, for example, that the main thoroughfare through the neighborhood, which goes north-south from Damascus Gate down to what is now called the Jewish Quarter, Tariq al-Wad, was a very busy thoroughfare, highly trafficked with constant wagon, cart, and pedestrian traffic. And there was a high presence of commercial spaces and activities. In contrast, the narrower arteries that were coming off of that main street and some of the other main mixed streets provided a less public, more private, more protected environment for residents. So this is also something to keep in mind. So whether for the calm of being out of the way of traffic and sort of commercial ebb and flow, or for the sense of greater seclusion or privacy, or a mix of both, long-term Jerusalemites were the least likely to live in the most mixed streets of Al-Wad. So to recap this part, what I hope to show through the lens of this one most mixed intramuros neighborhood, urban life in mixing itself was a complicated balance of legal, economic, religious, and cultural factors. There was also an unwritten confessionalization of space in the city that is invisible in maps and certainly invisible in the census mapping. We know, for example, that a number of Jewish memoirs talk about the fact that Jews were not permitted by Christians to go into the street adjoining the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example. The patriarch even claimed that they had been given a firman from Istanbul. The local Ottoman governor demanded to see that firman, and of course the patriarch was unable to produce it, but it didn't prevent other Christian youth from making sure that no Jews were to go into that area. So there's this sort of lived experience of space that is very different from and very difficult to extract from the documents and even this kind of new cartography. So it certainly brings to mind what the critical cartographers caution us, that maps lie, all maps lie, and this is perhaps just a different kind of lie than some of the other maps that I'm kind of responding to here. Nonetheless, I think it is still important to underscore the fact that both sociological indices as well as the memoir literature indicate that daily exposure to members of other groups is important in the lived perception and practice of integration or segregation. In this regard, then, Al-Wad measures as a highly integrated neighborhood, since virtually every street in the neighborhood intersected with one of the mixed streets. In other words, Al-Wad residents could not leave their homes and streets without literally bumping into neighbors of a different religion, ethnicity, or place of origin, not to mention the presence of other Jerusalemites attending to their business, administrative, or commercial needs in the neighborhood itself. This kind of urban proximity and experience, however, was already changing by the turn of the century, largely due to urban expansion outside the city walls, which began in the 1850s and was carried out by various foreign, private, philanthropic, and religious agents. At the time of the Second Ottoman Census of 1905, the outer city, or the extramuros city, consisted of 26 neighborhoods, compounds, and residential clusters that stretched north, south, and west of the city walls. And you'll see here a tremendous amount of expansion of the city by within 20 years. This extramuros expansion quickly altered the urban landscape and orientation. Most of the modern hospitals, schools, and consulates were built there. By the 1890s, the Jerusalem City Council, or the Beledia, moved to the new city. The municipal garden was built and became a mainstay of the leisure life of Jerusalemites, featuring weekend concerts by the local Ottoman military band and a classy cafe, which people could spend their time. For Jerusalemites of means, as well as new immigrants and foreign residents, settling outside the city walls offered wide open spaces, clean air, and modern amenities. There was a process of bourgeois flight that was beginning already in the 1880s, 1890s, and continuing. Here's one example of this, the government official Faidi al-Alami, who later became mayor of Jerusalem just a decade after this. He moved out of the old city into the neighborhood of Musrara, which is right outside the new gate here. His son says because of this desire to have more space and more breathing room, and he built his own house there in a lovely olive orchard. So 2 important processes took place as a result of this widespread urban extramuros expansion. First, some of these extramuros neighborhoods, like Musrara, where Faidi al-Alami and his family settled, developed into cosmopolitan middle-class enclaves, and the churches lost their stranglehold on their communities as Christians purchased land and built houses outside of the city and outside of the control of the patriarchate. At the same time, many of these new neighborhoods were sites of Muslim and Christian mixing, and al-Alami talks about this a lot. He also talks about some of his Jewish neighbors in Musrara, so we have to bring them into the mix as well, which underscored their political and intellectual, for at least Muslims and Christians, their political and intellectual coming together at the turn of the century. But the more consequential result of urban expansion was an increase in neighborhood-level homogeneity and segregation. And we see here this slide, which points out many of these new neighborhoods that were established were ethnically or ethno-religiously homogeneous. Over half of the Ottoman residents of the extramuros city lived in homogeneous neighborhoods, in contrast to only 1/5 of Ottomans who lived intramuros. And this affected the religious groups and ethnic groups differently and with a different kind of speed. By the turn of the century, 2/3 of the Jewish community lived outside of the city walls, but only 1/3 of Christians and 1/4 of Muslims did. Furthermore, one thing to point out is that at least some of these new Jewish neighborhoods and compounds were built surrounded by walls. And this is a neighborhood you can't really see. This is the top of the wall, Ole Moshe, which is behind Machane Yehuda neighborhood and Market now. But this was a form of defensive architecture that the Russian compound also had that closed them off from the surrounding area and ensured tight supervision over entry and exit from the neighborhood. These new neighborhoods often featured bakeries, synagogues, ritual baths, and other public services that decreased residents' need to leave the neighborhood, therefore sharply limiting their exposure to other Jerusalemites. As one of the foremost historical geographers of Jewish Jerusalem has characterized it, Ruth Kark, for those of you who know, these extramuros communities were, in fact, she calls them, voluntary ghettos, a development which would have staggering short and long-term implications for daily contact, social networks, and the urban landscape. In the pre-First World War period, the Zionist movement in Palestine and Europe was keenly aware of the importance of space and place for the national project. Arthur Rubin, the head of the Palestine office in Jaffa, and the top Zionist official in Palestine at the time, crafted an autonomy program that relied on the concentration of existing urban Jewish populations, stemming the flow of Jewish capital to Arab landlords. He also called for the creation of modern and Western Jewish neighborhoods to attract new migrants. In this case, Achuzat Bait, which later became Tel Aviv, was the model that they sought to replicate in Tiberias, in Haifa, and in Jerusalem and other cities. And the establishment even of a separate market and a separate economic zone for Jews was something that Rubin tried to bring to effect in Jaffa. All of these, I'll just point out, later developed in the British Mandate period. In the time that remains, I just want to briefly sketch out the question of residential patterns and urban relations as they continued into this first decade of British rule, which I should underscore is really accelerating many of these developments that had begun in the Ottoman period. The first one is the question of public spaces in Jerusalem. With the issuance of the Balfour Declaration and British support for its implementation, public spaces in Jerusalem became sites of fierce competition and rivalry. From spring of 1918 to 1920, there were at least 3 visits of the semi-official Zionist Commission featured here. At its head, of course, we have Chaim Weizmann. So at least 3 official visits to Palestine. Each time they were hosted and feted by Ronald Storrs, the British military governor of the city, who also invited religious and administrative dignitaries to attend the receptions. Each visit also precipitated a series of public demonstrations for and against Zionism in the city. So Jerusalem, by virtue of being the capital of the British military and then later civil administration, is also, of course, the locus for these political struggles for the future of the city and the country at large. Competing flags, signs, and anthems rang through the city on a regular basis. Of course, we have, and this is just an image of a demonstration in March of 1920. This was in support of Faisal, who had just declared his kingdom in Damascus, and they were calling for the support of an Arab kingdom and the integration of Palestine into this new independent Arab kingdom. But this demonstration took place only a few weeks before the April 1920 riots in Jerusalem, which resulted in 9 dead and 250 wounded Arabs and Jews. The next year, of course, in 1921, we have the Nabi Musa riots in Jaffa, another important mixed city. And in the aftermath, the Jerusalem paper, Mirat al-Sharq, published on its front page a highly censored statement, but I'm quoting here from the editor. "We often wonder, and rightly so, why it is that no such riots between Arabs and Jews ever took place here in Palestine before all the rest is whited out by the British military censor." So I just want to raise here, and of course many of you are already familiar with this, but I want to just raise and remind us all that cities become, and particularly these mixed cities, become sites of tremendous violence and symbolic contestations on an everyday basis, and part of that is attributed to a British divide and rule policy that they carry out. The second factor I want us to keep in mind is that the Jerusalem municipality, which previously had played a very active role in the city's life, was in the British period delegitimized and amputated, and was de facto, did not function for the first decade of British rule. In Ottoman times, the council had been comprised of local notables from the 3 religious communities, as well as official appointees, and it worked alongside other Ottoman provincial councils and the governor's office to ensure the smooth running of the city for all its residents. And I'll just mention here, there's a fascinating sort of archival find of the minutes of the Ottoman Municipal Council from the 1890s until 1915, and we see repeated mention of the ways in which the councilmen were responding to the needs of the various members of the communities there. So in terms of sending street washers to the various neighborhoods, in terms of giving city contracts to members of the different religious groups. So we see here, a real functioning of a multicultural city, not without its problems, of course, but it's a very stark difference to the British period. The British occupation forces transferred initially certain municipal tasks to the pro-Jerusalem committee and then to an appointed council. And so by the time we do have municipal elections in 1927, so a full decade after the British have installed themselves in Palestine, the elections become highly sectarianized. And we have here 2 different flyers from the Jewish community calling on Jerusalem's Jews to vote and to remember that the British appointed mayor, Ragab Nashashibi, had not served Jewish interest, and they sort of brought up this litany of complaints against him and these accusations of the city council as being biased against Jews, as not supporting Jewish neighborhoods as much as it supports other neighborhoods, and so on. So by the time we have, the first kind of open election for the municipality in the British period, it's already seen as completely sectarian. And we have the struggle between the national communities that had been taking place on the streets and in the public squares of the city that are now going to be transferred into the city council. Buttressed by the success of Tel Aviv, which gained its independent status from Jaffa, a Jewish political party in Jerusalem named Histadrut HaToshav, or the Union of the Resident, publicly advocated the establishment of a separate Hebrew municipality in Jerusalem. And this is the sort of dividing line that they saw. This should be the Hebrew municipality, this should be the Arab municipality. Now, what's interesting about this map is that it indicates that the spatial segregation between Jews and Arabs was, if not quite a physical and demographic reality, then at least an aspiration for significant numbers of Jewish leaders and voters in the 1920s. And this political party got the second highest number of votes then. So indeed, Jerusalem in the 1920s had seen a dramatic rise in population, which jumped almost 50% in that decade alone to a total of 90,000 people. The largest growth came from Muslims migrating from villages in the region and Jews immigrating from abroad. And at that point, 90% of Jerusalem's Jews lived in the new city. So we see here a real concentration in this area that community leaders are seeing as the core for their future separate municipality. However, the ongoing presence of Jews in mixed neighborhoods was a political problem for community leaders. And this is a very interesting episode that I don't have time to fully go into. I'll just mention a little bit about it. The Jewish Community Council in Jerusalem, which had been established in the post-World War I period, established this apartment subcommittee, which initially sought to sort of deal with this rise in rents and sort of the lack of affordable housing for immigrant Jews, and then later was going to turn to this question of Jews living in mixed houses and mixed neighborhoods. As one leader of the JCC wrote, quote, a mixed neighborhood endangers the security of the Hebrew community. And when they talk about security, we have to remember, of course, these very bloody riots, which the 1929 riots, of course, the most horrific of the three riots in that decade. But what's interesting to me is to note that this battle over these mundane, residential, seemingly unimportant spaces was taking place at the very same time that you have these much more publicized and public battles over sacred spaces, particularly over the Western Wall area, and the importance of those sort of religious, sacred, national spaces to the national project. We have also this articulation by the Jewish Community Council of Jerusalem that lived everyday spaces are no less important to the national project than that is. I'll just show here a survey. Wait, where's my survey? Here's my survey. So the Jewish Community Council, the Apartments Subcommittee, sent out inspectors to these neighborhoods and wrote down people who were living in non-Jewish houses, as they called them. They tried to convince them to move into Jewish neighborhoods to do their national duty. And they succeeded with some of them. Other of the residents, argued that they couldn't afford to live in some of the Jewish neighborhoods, or others argued that their landlords, their Arab landlords, one resident, Yitzhak Epstein, argued that his landlords, the Al-Ansaris, were, quote, honest, and their relations with Jews are very good and desirable. So we have a whole range of responses of the residents who were being sort of urged to move out. But it was a very, pressing problem for the Jewish Community Council that was rooted in demographic, economic, ideological, and political grounds. 900 households and work sites that were mixed meant that several thousand Jews were not living and working in exclusively Jewish areas. They saw these as transgressors, national transgressors. They came from all walks of life, doctors, lawyers, engineers, but also construction workers, drivers, greengrocers. And most offensive to the committee was the number of people in official Zionist capacities who rented from non-Jews, such as teachers from the Hebrew Gymnasia, professors from the Hebrew University, and employees of the Jewish Agency. And I'll just go back here to this previous sign. And this call for Jews to move out of mixed neighborhoods and into Hebrew neighborhoods and Hebrew houses was going hand in hand with the call for Hebrew labor and a Hebrew economy that had already been decades in the making as well. So it's not enough to move out of a non-Jewish house. You have to actually support the Jewish economy, the national economy, by building with Hebrew cement and using Jewish workers for that project. My point today has been to highlight some of the lesser-known contributing factors to the process of urban unmixing that had already begun prior to the 1948 war that split the city in two. These included legal limitations, religious boundaries dealing with purity and control, economics, colonial sectarianization, nationalist mobilization, and, of course, violence all played a role in changing the urban landscape. Today I'll just add that Al-Wad, our quintessential mixed neighborhood in the Ottoman city, is once again the center of a forced project of remixing or a different kind of unmixing. In the last couple of years, dozens of Palestinian families living in Al-Wad were evicted because they were found to be living in properties that had been owned by or leased by Jewish families before the 1948 war. So this struggle, over these specific spaces is still going on today, and that's also one of the complexities in terms of trying to find and to deal with historical and archival and cartographic evidence from this is that there's an ongoing legal situation that makes many people resistant to share these kinds of documents with me. So I think I'll end here and take any questions that you have. Thank you.